The wind was a razor blade across the high prairie, finding every gap in the rough-hewn cabin walls, whining a mournful tune that echoed the emptiness inside Alara. Dust devils danced like mocking spirits in the distance, promising nothing but grit and desolation. It had been 2 months since the wagon had rattled away, taking her husband with it, promising return, delivering only silence. 2 months of stretching meager stores, fending off the chill that settled not just in the air but in her bones, and enduring the sidelong glances of the few neighbors left who saw a woman alone not as resilient, but as vulnerable, a claim to be made, a weakness to exploit. Her hands, once soft, were raw and chapped, marked by the unending struggle to haul water from the frozen creek, split wood that seemed to fight back, and mend clothes threadbare from weariness. Fear was a constant, tight knot in her stomach, a cold weight that pressed down on her chest with every creak of the cabin, every howl of the wind. It whispered doubts in the long nights, asking how long she could endure this solitude, this relentless chipping away at her spirit. They said a woman needed a man out here. The unspoken threat in those words, delivered with pity or predatory calculation, was a different kind of chill. She was running out of flour, out of firewood, out of the fragile hope she'd clung to like a desperate prayer. Her gaze, fixed on the horizon where the wagon had vanished, held a weary resignation, a defeat she fought against with every breath, but felt closing in like the encroaching winter. Then, a shape detached itself from the shimmering haze of dust and distance. A rider. Her breath hitched. Not the wagon. Not him. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. Who? Few traveled this way unless they had purpose, and purpose out here was rarely benign for a woman alone. She retreated inside, peering through the single, grimy window, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the heavy iron skillet by the hearth. It was a poor weapon, but it was all she had. The rider drew closer, the figure sharpening against the pale sky. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a familiar, quiet competence. He dismounted, his movements economical, untying a saddlebag. A long coat, dusted with travel. A rifle but visible above the saddle. He turned towards the cabin. The angle of his shoulders, the set of his head. A spark ignited within her, small and tentative, battling the ingrained fear. He walked towards the door, slow and steady, his eyes scanning the small yard, the cabin. He stopped a few paces away, not knocking, just standing there, silent, patient. The wind whipped around him, but he seemed rooted, a part of the harsh landscape. Then he lifted his gaze to the window. Their eyes met through the glass, hers wide with apprehension and a dawning, unbelievable recognition. His unreadable, shadowed by the brim of his hat. It was Caleb Thorne, the quiet boy from the neighboring claim, who'd left years ago to fight in a war that felt a world away. He was a man now, weathered and scarred by trials she couldn't imagine. The skillet felt heavy, then suddenly useless, in her hand. The knot in her stomach didn't vanish, but it shifted, transforming into a complex tangle of shock, uncertainty, and a ghost of a long-forgotten feeling safety. He just stood there, waiting. The wind wailed around the cabin, a lonely sound, and in the fragile silence that stretched between them across the few yards, Alara felt a shift, imperceptible yet profound. Her crisis hadn't ended, but its shape had changed with the arrival of a ghost from the past. He didn't force his way in. He didn't call out promises or platitudes. Caleb simply settled near the cabin, a quiet, watchful presence. He unsaddled his horse, hobbled it near the struggling creek where thin ice still clung to the banks, and then, without a word, he began collecting fallen branches, his movements deliberate and practiced. Alara watched him from the window, the skillet still clutched loosely in her hand. He worked with a stoic efficiency that both unnerved and reassured her. He wasn't asking for anything. He was simply being there. It was a strange form of protection, this silent occupation of the space around her vulnerability. Her internal monologue was a whirlwind of questions. Why was he here? Did he know? Had he seen her husband? Or had he heard the whispers, the rumors of her precarious state. Pride warred with her desperate need. She should send him away, tell him she was fine, that she didn't need charity or watchful eyes. But her body ached with exhaustion. Her hands were raw, and the fire was dying down to embers she lacked the strength to replenish properly. He finished gathering wood, piling it neatly near the door. Then he went to the creek, broke the ice with the heel of his boot, and filled a bucket. He carried it to the horse, then back to the cabin, setting it near the woodpile without a word. Alara didn't open the door. She couldn't. Not yet. The silence was thick, heavy with unspoken history and present hardship. She watched him through the glass, noting the subtle lines etched around his eyes, the way he held himself ready, but not aggressive. He didn't look at her again, not directly. He seemed content to let his actions speak. And they spoke volumes. He was providing basic necessities, the very things she was struggling most to acquire. He was acknowledging her plight without humiliating her with pity. Later, as dusk began to paint the sky in bruised purples and oranges, she saw him build a small, smokeless fire a distance from the cabin, preparing a simple meal. The scent of wood smoke, thin and clean, drifted on the wind, a stark contrast to the stale air inside her home. Still, she did not emerge. The fear hadn't fully receded, but the sharp edge of panic had softened, replaced by a wary curiosity and a grudging gratitude. He wasn't a threat, not in the way she'd come to expect threats. He was Caleb, somehow returned from the crucible of war to the desolate prairie where they had once been simply children, chasing jackrabbits and sharing sun-warmed berries. That memory, faint and fragile, was a strange comfort. As the first stars pricked the twilight, she finally opened the door, just a crack. The cold air rushed in, biting at her exposed skin. Caleb looked up from his fire, his face illuminated by the low flames. He said nothing, just waited. "Caleb," she managed, her voice a dry rasp. It was the first word she had spoken aloud in 2 days that wasn't a plea to a silent god or a whispered curse against the wind. He nodded slowly, a simple acknowledgement. Alara, his voice was low, quiet, like the rustle of dry leaves. Not the voice of a hero or a savior, but of a man who had seen hard things and carried their weight silently. The space between them was vast with time and experience, but suddenly, it felt less like an insurmountable chasm and more like a bridge waiting to be crossed. She didn't cross it that night. She closed the door again, the sound echoing slightly in the stillness. But she left the skillet by the hearth, not in her hand. The first tremor of tentative trust had passed between them. The next day, Caleb continued his quiet work. He reinforced the loose shutters, shoring up the cabin against the insistent wind. He checked the small trapline she had set, rebaiting the empty ones and adding a small rabbit to her meager larder without drawing attention to the gift. Alara watched him, her initial fear slowly morphing into a guarded acceptance, then something akin to reluctant dependence. Her internal landscape was shifting. Despair had been her constant companion, a heavy shroud, but his silent competence was like a small, persistent light, pushing back the edges of the darkness. She still didn't understand his motives, but his actions were undeniably protective, undeniably kind in a world that had shown her little kindness since her husband's departure. Their dialogue remained minimal, almost ritualistic. She would open the door when he approached with water or wood, accepting the offering with a curt nod and a quiet "thank you." He would respond with a low "Alara" or nothing at all, his gaze steady but not probing. It was an understanding built not on words, but on necessity and observation. She observed the efficiency of his movements, the quiet strength in his hands, the way his eyes scanned the horizon constantly, a habit perhaps learned in the war, but one that made her feel inexplicably safer. He observed, she supposed, her weariness, the thinness of her frame, the raw edges of her resolve. He didn't comment on her husband's absence, or the state of her claim, or the hardship etched on her face. He simply saw the need and addressed it with quiet capability. The external threat, previously an abstract fear of starvation and isolation, began to take a more defined shape. Jedediah Pruitt, the man who held the paper on her claim, rode by one afternoon. He was a large man, his face a roadmap of greed, his eyes lingering too long on the cabin, on her. He didn't stop this time, but his presence was a promise of future trouble. Alara felt the familiar knot of fear tighten, but this time, when she looked out, she saw Caleb by the creek, ostensibly checking his traps, but his posture was subtly different, still watchful. Pruitt saw him, his gaze narrowed, and he rode on without stopping. Caleb's silent presence had deflected the threat, for now. That evening, as Caleb tended his fire and she ate the rabbit stew, the most substantial meal she'd had in weeks, a different kind of silence fell between them. It wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken things. The shared space felt less like a boundary and more like a fragile connection. Alara finally spoke more than 2 words. "You didn't have to stay." Caleb looked up, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Came home," he said simply. "Saw you needed help." No elaboration, no explanation for his return or how he knew. Just that simple, undeniable truth. She needed help. And he, the quiet boy who had become a man forged in conflict, was providing it, not out of obligation, it seemed, but out of some deeper, silent understanding that transcended the years and the hardship that lay between their childhood and this moment. Her heart ached with a complex mix of relief, confusion, and a nascent gratitude that felt dangerously close to hope. The resilience she had fought so hard to maintain alone now felt less like a lonely battle and more like a quiet stand taken side by side. The air grew colder, promising a swift descent into winter. The unspoken threat represented by Pruitt became more pressing. He rode out again the following afternoon, this time with 2 other men, stopping near the cabin. Alara saw them from the window, her heart leaping into her throat. This was it. They wanted the claim, and they saw her as an easy target. She braced herself, reaching for the skillet, the familiar knot of fear a cold stone in her gut. Then she saw Caleb walking slowly from the creek bed, wiping his hands on his trousers. He didn't quicken his pace, didn't draw a weapon, just walked steadily towards the 3 mounted men. Pruitt's sneer was visible even from a distance. "Thorn," he called out, his voice oily. "Didn't know you were back. Come to claim what's yours." The implication hung heavy in the air. He meant the land, perhaps, but his eyes flicked towards the cabin. Caleb stopped a few yards from their horses, his hands loose at his sides, his posture relaxed yet alert. "Came home," he repeated, the same quiet phrase he'd used with Alara, but now it held a different weight. "This is Alara's place." His voice was low, even, but it carried an unmistakable current of unwavering resolve. It wasn't a challenge, but a simple statement of fact, backed by the quiet power of his presence. The history of his time away etched in his bearing. Pruitt's gaze lingered on Caleb, assessing. He saw not the boy who had left, but a man who had faced harder things than a greedy land grab. There was a tense silence, broken only by the stamping of horses' hooves and the relentless wind. Pruitt hesitated, his eyes narrowing. He exchanged a look with his companions. This wasn't the easy takeover he'd envisioned. The woman wasn't alone. Finally, with a grunt of frustration, Pruitt reined his horse around. "This ain't over, Thorn," he spat, though the bluster lacked conviction. "We'll be back." They rode away, leaving the quiet landscape to settle once more. Alara watched them go, her hands trembling, not from fear now, but from the sudden release of tension. She looked at Caleb. He hadn't moved, just watched until they were specks on the horizon. He turned then, looking towards the cabin. He didn't smile, but something in his gaze had softened. He walked towards the door. Alara opened it before he reached it. She didn't need to ask if he was staying. It was understood. The silence between them was no longer born of fear or uncertainty, but of a shared moment of defiance, a quiet victory. Her internal monologue settled, the frantic questions replaced by a deep, abiding sense of relief and gratitude. She was still vulnerable, the future still uncertain, but she wasn't alone. The quiet boy had returned a man, and his silent strength had met her desperate resilience. The wind still howled, but it no longer sounded quite so lonely. The cabin felt less like a prison and more like a refuge. After Pruitt and his men rode away, a profound stillness settled over the small claim. Caleb walked back to his meager camp by the creek, and Alara remained by the door, watching him. The threat hadn't been vanquished forever, the lingering promise of their return a shadow on the horizon. But for this moment, there was peace. Later, as the sun dipped below the prairie, painting the sky in hues of fire and ash, Alara walked towards Caleb's camp. It was the first time she had willingly approached him. He looked up as she neared, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Thank you," she said, her voice low, steady. It felt inadequate, a small word for the large weight lifted from her shoulders. He nodded, stirring the embers of his fire. "Didn't need thanks," he paused, then added, "We knew each other, Alara." It wasn't an explanation for his help, but a simple statement of their shared past, the foundation on which this fragile present was built. It was enough, more than enough. It acknowledged the connection that had transcended years of separation and the crucible of war. She sat on a nearby rock, the cold seeping into her clothes, but she barely noticed. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the stars emerge, brighter and colder than she remembered. The hardships hadn't vanished, the winter was coming. The claim was still contested. Her husband was still gone. But the crushing weight of facing it all alone had lifted. Looking out at the vast, indifferent landscape, Alara felt a quiet strength bloom within her. She had endured, she had fought, and when help had arrived in the most unexpected form, she had found the courage to accept it. Her journey from despair to resilience hadn't been a solitary one after all. It had been a path she walked first alone, then alongside a silent, steadfast figure from her past. Caleb stirred the fire again, a shower of sparks rising into the night. "We'll face whatever comes," he said, his gaze fixed on the flames, not looking at her, but speaking to the shared future that had just been forged. It wasn't a grand promise, but a simple, solid declaration of partnership. The silence that followed was one of mutual understanding, a quiet promise reflected in the steady glow of the firelight on their faces. The prairie was harsh, unforgiving, a place where dreams often turned to dust. But in this quiet moment, under the vast, star-filled sky, Alara felt a fragile, resilient hope take root. She was no longer defined solely by loss and vulnerability, but by the quiet strength she had discovered within herself and the unexpected, profound connection she had found standing beside the man who had simply, quietly, come home. The journey ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready. They felt ready.